This is the issue, and I am the ghetto man. Today's issue, treason in America. Back in 1994, I wrote an article that appeared in a newsletter called Inappropriate Persona, one that I was distributing at the time. And what I did is I went through exactly what happened during the Gulf Crisis back in 1991. Everything that the president said and did, Congress said and did, and how the United Nations, how it works, and how what its authority is, if any, under our treaty laws. Well, anyway, what I did is I picked this one thing because what President Bush did is exactly what every president after him has done, and even before him. It's just that he was so blatant about it that it makes a perfect example of, treason in America. What he did that was treasonous, what Congress did that was treasonous. And then also take a look at what the United Nations is and then what kind of authority it has over the United States citizen and whether or not it can supersede the United States Constitution, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and go through that particular article, and we're going to discuss, exactly what happened and why it was treason. And it's really a prime example of even what's going on today with President Trump, his bombing of Syria, and then Afghanistan, and how those actions, too, were in violation of the Constitution. So I'm not going to sit here and try to say, one party's better than the other. What I would like to do is make sure that we all understand how our system of government works so that we can identify a person or persons who are blatantly violating it so that we can call them on that. I mean, that's what the duty of the sovereign is. If we, the people, are the sovereign and we're the boss, we need to make sure that those people that are working for us, serving us, are obeying the law. If they're not obeying the law, then, like anybody else, they should be treated as a criminal and prosecuted under the same terms and conditions as any other person in this country. If there's any equality at all, which I've talked about before, it is the equal protection under the law, and that's it. That's it. That's the only equality there is, equal protection under the law. Every person, regardless, race, creed, color, all that nonsense, they all are treated exactly the same under the law. With that said, let's get on with part one. I'm going to also do this in two parts, part 1 and 2, Treason in America. So let's get on with it. Part 1, Treason in America. Our nation has been seized by rebels, a vicious band of treacherous traitors that are committing high treason against the American people and our laws. These traitors are trampling upon the United States Constitution and are making a mockery out of our Republican form of government. And what are the citizens of this nation doing about this problem? Not one thing. The majority of the people in this country could care less. Why? Because they have been deceived by these evil people that what they are doing is lawful. Look around. Wrong has become right, and right has become wrong. Everything is upside down today. Instead of prosecuting these traitors for political sedition, insurrection, and treason, we praise them instead, acquitting them of all of their wrongdoings and evil deeds. In a nutshell, we make heroes out of traitors. Now, why would we do that? Well, we do it so that the United States of America can make the world safe for the vilest form of government that has ever emerged out of the minds of a reprobate, democracy. If there ever was a form of government that could destroy everything that is righteous and just, democracy is that form of government. Our nation's founding fathers understood the evils of democracy. See my show, Ghettoman on Democracy. I cover the entire history of democracy. Our founding fathers and their warnings about democracy still echo down the corridors of time today. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security of the rights of property, and have been, in general, short in their lives, as they have been violent in their deaths. That was said by James Madison in Federalist Paper Number 10, New York, March 17th, 1788. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. That was said by John Adams. A democracy is the vilest form of government there is. That was Thomas Paine. And he didn't say it was one of the worst forms of government there is. He said it was the vilest form of government there is. The surest and most effective way to destroy our constitutional republic is to promote the democratic form of government. History tells us that democracy is the traitor's choice of government. It is a vehicle to a dictatorship. In fact, democracy is what is destroying our republic right now. Our nation is completely controlled by corrupt politicians who openly promote the democratic process. It doesn't matter if it's the Democratic Party or if it's the Republican Party. Both parties promote the same thing, democracy. When was the last time you heard a Republican promote a Republican form of government? Whatever happened to the republic for which it stands? You are what you are, not what you say you are. There are so many traitors within our government today, it boggles the imagination. All of them are promoting the same thing, world democracy, under the control of the United Nations and its dictatorial rule. Now, with this in mind, let's take a closer look at the subject of this show, Treason in America. Now, as an example, 26 years ago, the most blatant act of treason in my lifetime was perpetuated against the United States Constitution and the American people under the Bush administration in 1991. It was orchestrated by the United Nations, President Bush, Congress, and the American people. It was called Desert Storm, remember? I called it Desert Dust. It is important to note that the Bush family was involved in the financing of Hitler. And it was George Bush Sr.'s father and George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, and it was in 1945 or it was 42 or 45. His assets were frozen under the Trading with the Enemy Act because he was financing Hitler. And of course, after the war was over, and his assets were frozen, like I said. And after the war was over, what did they do? They made him senator, a Nazi. Okay, now this is a strong accusation, and in order for us to fully understand its implication, a complete and thorough study of the facts and the law surrounding this dark chapter in American history is in order. What was the purpose of the war on Iraq? President Bush continually told the American people that the reason we were going to war over Iraq is, one, to liberate the state of Kuwait, and two, to establish a new world order. Well, what is the New World Order? Well, the New World Order is a term used by a small group of international bankers and elitists whose goal is to put all the nations of the world under a sole and despotic control of a single body politic called the United Nations. The United Nations, you say? Yeah. Yep, the United Nations. Well, what is the United Nations anyway? Well, the United Nations is a foreign body politic that was created in the wake of World War II in 1945. It is the love child of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a National Socialist. He didn't support a Republican form of government. He didn't support the Constitution, who through the democratic process attempted to nullify our constitutional republic with his communist anti-American program called the New Deal. Now, what's interesting about that is that he called this New Deal, which was nothing more than socialism. What was wrong with the old deal? What was wrong with the Constitution of the United States? What was wrong with the visions of the founders of our republic? What was wrong with our law the way it was? But he had a New Deal. The name United Nations was adopted as a tribute to Roosevelt, who died a few weeks before its organization. The United Nations claims to be an organization of independent sovereign nations that has no sovereignty of its own. In other words, it has no authority over anybody, no sovereignty of its own, whose primary purpose is, and I'm going to read directly from its charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. I'm going to stop there. We're talking about human rights here, not constitutionally protected inalienable rights, which I have a video on, Ghettoman on inalienable rights, and explains what the difference is between a civil right, a constitutional right, a human right. Anyway, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights of men and women, and of nations, large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, to practice tolerance, and to live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institutions of methods that armed forces shall not be used save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. And that was the preamble of the United Nations Charter, January 1st, 1945. In plain English, the United Nations claims to promote the dream of a utopian one world order, where all the nations of the world will work and live in peace and harmony. That sounds good, doesn't it? But I have one question. Who will govern it? Who will govern this utopian new world order? Will it be we, the people of the United States, pursuant to our Republican form of government, under the mandates of our Constitution, based upon biblical principles? Or will it be we, the elite, pursuant to the will of the international banking cartels and the global elite and the United Nations Charter? These two questions are extremely important and must be answered. How does the United Nations operate anyway? The three principal organs of the United Nations are first, a General Assembly where questions and matters within the scope of the United Nations Charter are discussed. Second, a Security Council. Its primary responsibility is for the maintenance of international peace. And third, a Security and a Economic and Social Council, which makes or initiates studies and reports with respect to international economic, social, culture, educational, and health. Now, the decision-making process of each organ is accomplished by vote. Now, it's important that I say this right here. It's important to note that none of the members of the General Assembly Security Council, or any other council for that matter, are elected by we the people of the United States. The election process is closed to the citizens of the United States. Very few people in the United States even know who the president of the United Nations is, let alone how he was elected in the office. Do you know who the president of the United Nations is? Did you vote for him? Unlike our constitutional republic, where our servants are elected and answer directly to we the people of the United States, the United Nations officials are elected by and answer to its members only. With this fact in mind, and in light of the subject matter of this commentary, Treason anit-American, let's look at the functions of the Security Council. The Security Council is composed of 15 members. 5 of its members are permanent. That's China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and of course the United States. It is interesting to note that 2 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia, are nations known for their brutality. Remember the brutal massacre of the students in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China? There are also 10 non-permanent members that are elected by the General Assembly just to serve 2-year terms. During the purported Gulf Crisis, the non-permanent members of the Security Council were Canada, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Cuba, Ethiopia, Finland, Malaysia, Romania, Yemen, and Zaire. The vote of the United Nations Security Council represents the vilest form of government in the world today, which include, but are not limited to, totalitarianism, communism, socialism, dictatorships, and of course, democracies. Liberty, rights, justice, property, and freedom, things that we Americans hold close to our hearts, lose their true meaning in the company of the United Nations Security Council. Do you think that the word liberty has the same meaning in China as it does in the United States? Do you think the word justice has the same meaning in Russia as it does in the United States? Do you think these words, or the words of property or freedom, do you think they have the same meaning in Cuba as it does in the United States? What we Americans fail to recognize is that the function of the United Nations is not based on the vision of our nation's founding fathers or the principles found in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Instead, they are based on the homogenized ideals and visions of the United Nations founders, who look upon individual national sovereignty and freedom, which includes all religious thought and principles, as the law of the jungle. And they think that because they haven't got control of it. National sovereignty is a threat to the United Nations' perverted definition of world peace. As you will soon discover here, the United Nations definition of world peace actually means world dominance and control. It is through the pretended authority of the United Nations Security Council that all the countries of the world, whether they are members of the United Nations or not, are forced to comply with what it dictates, or they'll be destroyed. The inalienable rights that we Americans are guaranteed and protected by the United States Constitution do not exist in the United Nations Charter. Now, inalienable rights are the rights created by Yahweh and given to us by Him, or rights created by nature if you don't believe in a God. These natural rights cannot be surrendered without the consent of the one possessing such right. Instead, our inalienable rights are substituted by human rights. And human rights are the creation of man, subject to man's will, interpretation, and application, and can be revoked at the pleasure of the civil government that created them in the first place. Human rights are not founded upon biblical principles. The United Nations is an anti-biblical organization with an anti-biblical agenda. Now, we Americans have been taught that the United States Constitution contains the best system of government in the world. We are continually told that we are the freest and most just nation in the world. If this is true, why do we need the United Nations and its charter to secure world peace? Couldn't we use the United States Constitution instead? Why not invite all of the nations of the world to join our republic and become a state and or territory within our union? Wouldn't this establish world peace? Can you imagine all the nations of the world under the protection of the United States Constitution? If the United States Constitution represents the most just form of government in the world, why haven't the principles found in our law been adopted worldwide? What does the United Nations Charter have to offer the people of the world that the United States Constitution could not fulfill? Is the form of government contained in the United Nations Charter superior to the United States Constitution? If so, in what way? Are you willing to surrender the United States of America to the United Nations? Are you willing to place the American people under the control of the United Nations Charter and its unelected members? Do you want the United Nations Security Council imposing its will on the United States of America? With the help of the President, Congress, and of course the blind support of the American people, the United Nations has become the supreme government of the world. Every country on the planet, including the United States, is now subject to the mandates of the United Nations Charter and the Security Council. The Constitution of the United States is nothing more than a doormat for Congress to wipe its feet on before beginning each session. Our national flag, our nation's flag, now flies under the flag of the United Nations. Only a conquered nation would fly its flag under a conqueror. Yes, the United States of America is a conquered nation. It was conquered from within and done without firing a shot. To understand how this was accomplished, let's take a look at the events that took place during this purported Gulf Crisis. Let's look at treason in America. Today, the United Nations controls the world. If a nation, whether that nation is a member or not, refuses to comply with the will of the Security Council, that nation will be forced to comply. Compliance is forced on a nation in two ways. One, by sanctions, and two, by war. Sanctions are usually imposed in two ways. One, economically and or a trade embargo. If a nation refuses to obey the mandates of the Security Council, the first step in compliance is to freeze the nation's assets abroad and cut off its trade, i.e. food and fuel and supply. If sanctions fail, then peace forces, military forces applied. And where does the United Nations get its power? It gets it from its member nations who must, pursuant to their treaty with the United Nations, and of course the laws of their land, commit its war-making capabilities to the United Nations and its goals. Why? because the United Nations has no war-making capabilities of its own. It has no army, it has no navy, it has no air force. In other words, each of the United Nations member states must independently, according to their own national laws, declare war against the United Nations targeted country. As citizens of the United States, we have a strong interest in the actions of our public servants. We elect them into public office to represent us pursuant to the United States Constitution. In the event that our nation is to become engaged in war with a foreign country, it must be done in the strictest sense, according to the laws of our land, not pursuant to the laws of a foreign body politic, which that is what the UN is, a foreign body politic. On January 12, 1991, Congress passed House Joint Resolution 77. House Joint Resolution 77 unlawfully authorized the President to use the United States Armed Forces pursuant to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 678, and that was in 1990, in order to achieve implementation of Security Council's Resolutions 660, 662, 664, 665, 666, 667, 669, 670, 674, and 677. Now, can Congress commit American blood and treasure to war pursuant to the mandates of the United Nations? Well, the answer to that question is obvious, especially if you've listened to any of my shows. That answer is no. Now, in this particular show, you will discover that Congress, by passing House Joint Resolution 77, committed an act of treason against the United States Constitution and the American people. Why? Because House Joint Resolution 77 was clearly in violation of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the United States Constitution, which reads, Congress shall have the power to declare war. Pretty clear, I think. Was House Joint Resolution 77 a declaration of war? No, it wasn't. In this show, you will also discover that the only reason Congress passed House Joint Resolution 77 was to protect President Bush and his treasonous acts against the United States from creating a constitutional crisis with efforts of his impeachment. Why? Because prior to Congress passing House Joint Resolution 77, President Bush made it clear that he was going to carry out the will of the United Nations Security Council and go to war with Iraq, even if Congress prohibited it. Now, can the President commit the United States Armed Forces to war without a formal declaration of war by an act of Congress? And the answer to that question is no. No, we can't. We have the separation of powers doctrine, remember? The President's first and foremost duty is to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's his first duty. Not to protect me, not to protect the American people, not to protect their property, but to protect the United States Constitution. And that means upholding it. That means obeying the law. Now, prior to Bush taking his office, the office of president, he must take an oath, which reads, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to my best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. First and foremost, that can be found in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 8 of the United States Constitution. If the President does not preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, he's in violation of his allegiance, the allegiance that he owed to his country. This is called treason. Plain and simple, treason. And what is treason? Well, Webster's dictionary defines it as treason, violation of the allegiance owed to one's sovereign or state, betrayal of one's country. And when you don't obey the law and you just do what you want, you're not obeying the laws of your country. It's treason. The moment that President Bush stated that he would go to war, even if Congress prohibited it, he violated his oath of office and committed treason against the Constitution of the United States. Now, that's what I'm going to pause here for 1 second here. This is exactly when I took and made the 3 shows dealing with, who can declare war. And I pointed out that President Trump also, bombed Syria and then bombed Afghanistan, that both of those attacks were in violation of his oath of office. Now, whether people think that he's doing a good job or not, that's not what this show is all about. This show is about how we are all held responsible, equal protection of the law or equal application of the law. Just because you're the president of the United States and you're somebody who's or rich or whatever your case may be, you don't have a right to do whatever you want and be above the law. Okay, in the United States, who has the power to declare war against a foreign nation? Who has the power to commit the lives of our men and women in our Army, Navy, and Air Force to an armed confrontation? Is it the president? Is it Congress? In the United States, only Congress has the power to declare war. And this is not an argument that is open for debate. It was settled over 200 years ago and has been reaffirmed over and over by the Supreme Court of the United States. There is not one word in the Constitution that grants the power to any other body of government. It runs to Congress only. The United States Supreme Court ruled that, and I'm quoting, by the Constitution, Congress alone has the power to declare national or foreign war. The Constitution confers on the president the whole executive power. He has not power to initiate or declare war either against a foreign nation or a domestic state. If a war be made by invasion of a foreign nation, the president is not only authorized but bound to resist force by force. He does not initiate the war, but is bound to accept the war. But is bound to accept the challenge without waiting for any special legislative authority. Second block, and this can be found in 635 on page 635, 668, 17 Lawyers Edition, Supreme Court Cases, page 459. The executive power shall, and this is the Supreme Court going on, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. The general scope of this executive power is declaration in an oath prescribed to him in the same article that he will protect and preserve and defend the Constitution of the United States. He is, under all circumstances, to respect and abstain from exercising the power confined to the legislature and the judiciary. The office of the President of the United States has 2 functions. One, the title to be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy on the United States and the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. So in other words, he becomes Commander-in-Chief only when there's been a declaration of war by an act of Congress. He's president until then. And then he only remains Commander-in-Chief as long as the war is being prosecuted. 2, the power and duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So his second job is to make sure that all the laws in the United States are effectively or properly executed. Under the first head, the commander of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and the militia in actual service. A vague and anonymous authority is asserted, which is called the war power. If this means anything, the war power, if this means anything more than the commanding of the Army, Air Force, Navy, and the militia in time of war, insurrection, invasion, or apprehended invasions, or for the execution of the laws, then it is denied that any such power exists under the Constitution. It does not involve, but rather does it necessarily deny any power to the executive to change, suspend, or repeal the law. So the executive branch of government can't do anything except apply the law. He is to act as commander-in-chief, not as legislator or emperor. To say that he can declare war because in an event of war, he commands the Army, Air Force, Navy, and militia in service when war is declared under the Constitution is absurd. By the Constitution, the power to declare war is granted to Congress. And by this grant, it is excluded from the competency and authority of the other two coordinated branches of the government. Articles of Confederation, Article 9, the Federalists, number 23 and 41, under the story of the constitutional law. That's hard to read. Some of that older English is hard to read. The way they structure their sentences, I start flowing the way I like to write, and it's like trying to run through a bunch of tires. Okay, a modern idea upon the subject is that under the law of nations, or the United Nations, as a state of war with all its incidents may exist without the declaration of war, and as a condition of hostilities may arise in such a manner as require the force of the nation to be used in recess of Congress. Therefore, the executive may accept war, and the country may be involved in all the consequences of war without the consent of Congress. This is denied. The true construction of the Constitution in this respect is that the question of war or peace, a question so momentous and it's in its consequences and so ramified, is a question to be determined by Congress, passed by both houses and approved by the executive. The Constitution had no reference to the question whether war under the law of nations, the United Nations, could exist without a declaration of war. It had no reference to any supposed distinction between the power to declare war and the supposed power to accept war. It treats of the substance, not the form, of the results and not the antecedents. It provides a condition under all circumstances to the state of war. It declares that the United States shall not be involved in war except by act of Congress, and that can be found in the Prize cases, 1862, Book 67, United States Supreme Court, 635. Okay, now this concludes part one of Treason in America, so just stay tuned for part two. During the purported Gulf Crisis, President Bush openly demonstrated his contempt for the Constitution of the United States and the American people. He acted as king. He was willing, in violation of the supreme law of the land, to place American lives in jeopardy. And what did the Americans do about his obvious acts of treason? They did nothing. Instead, they supported him by hanging yellow ribbons all over their cities and towns. Perhaps the color yellow denotes the true spirit of the American people today. If President Bush wasn't acting under the authority of the United States Constitution, what authority, if any, was he acting under? President Bush continually stated that he was going to use United States Armed Forces pursuant to the United Nations Security Council and its resolutions. Now, can a president independently act pursuant to the United Nations Charter? Does the United Nations Charter supersede the United States Constitution? Well, the answer to that is obvious. No, it does not. The United Nations Charter falls under the treaty clause of Article 6 of the United States Constitution, which reads as follows: the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made pursuant thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. Article 6 of the United States Constitution. It is believed by most people that the clause, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, allows a treaty to supersede the Constitution of the United States. Well, this analogy is incorrect and has been addressed by the United States Supreme Court many, many times. Quoting the court, "There is nothing in this language which intimates that treaties and laws enacted pursuant to them do not have to comply with the provisions of the Constitution, nor is there anything in the debates which accompanied the drafting and ratification of the Constitution which even suggests such a result. It would be manifestly contrary to the objections of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition, to construe Article 6 as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement, which would be the United Nations Charter, without observing constitutional prohibitions. In effect, such construction would permit an amendment of that document in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. The prohibitions of the Constitution were designed to apply to all branches of the national government, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. And that was Reed versus Colvert, to be found in 354 U.S. 1. Now, I'm going to back up here for a little bit. It says, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. See, this is the separation of powers. See, when a president, for instance, a president does an executive order, he can't make that executive order that supersedes the legislative authority to make law. He can't make law. Now, he can make orders that deal with those things pertaining to the executive branch of government, but he can't make things that that are actually law. And that's what, like, President Roosevelt did when he outlawed gold in the United States. He took away people's property without due process of law. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Anyway, let's get back to the issue at hand. Now, there's during the Gulf Crisis, there was a professor. His name was Van Alstyne. I guess that's how it's pronounced. It's Alstyne. Now, he made this point, and when I talk about this point, the fact that the separation of powers, the executive branch can't just, override the other two branches. He made this point emphatically at the Judiciary Committee hearing prior to the final debate concerning House Joint Resolution 77. This is what he said, quote, "The fact that the United Nations has authorized its member states to consider individually going to war is of greatest political influence, but in no way improves upon the need of the president to get an authorization from Congress to carry out that authorization from the United Nations." Now, that's from the congressional record. That was Senate January 12, 1991. Now, this brings us to House Joint Resolution 77, which states in pertinent part, Section 2, the authorization for use of United States Armed Forces. It says, A, authorization. The president is authorized to use United States Armed Forces pursuant to United Nations Security Council's Resolution 678, 1990, in order to achieve implementation of Security Council Resolutions 660, 662, 664, 665, 666, 667, 669, 670, 674, and 677. Okay, that's what it said. Okay, House Joint Resolution 77 clearly violates Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which states as follows: Congress shall have the power to declare war. There is nothing within the resolution that states that the United States of America could declare war against Iraq. There was nothing there that said that the United States had declared war against Iraq. Instead, it states that the president is authorized to use United States Armed Forces pursuant to United Nations Security Council resolutions. Now, the question that purports itself is, can Congress delegate its war-making authority over to a foreign body politic? Well, the answer is obvious. No, it cannot. And this is exactly what Congress did. Instead of declaring war against Iraq, it delegated its war-making authorities over to the United Nations. Congress authorized the President of the United States to command American armed forces pursuant to the mandates of the United Nations Security Council. As stated earlier, the United Nations is a foreign body politic. None of its members are elected or controlled by we the people or the Constitution of the United States, for that matter. It is a foreign nation. It even has its own post office. A UN postage as opposed to a U.S. postage, just like a separate nation would have its own postage. The Constitution of the United States does not grant Congress any authority to place its war-making powers in the hands of any other branch of government, nor does it permit Congress to delegate that power to a governing body that has been created pursuant to the Treaty Clause of Article 6 of the United States Constitution. Congress, in passing House Joint Resolution 77, did just that. Amended the Constitution of the United States in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. And the court case, remember we said it, Reed versus Culvert, it was one we mentioned before. In effect, House Joint Resolution 77 nullified Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the United States Constitution. By passing House Joint Resolution 77, Congress committed political insurrection against the United States of America. Now, what is political insurrection? Well, I've mentioned this in other shows, but political insurrection is when public servants rise up against the Constitution of the United States and attempt to alter and or abolish it by enacting void laws that infringe upon the inalienable rights of the sovereign citizens of the United States. Now, do you want the president declaring war without a lawful act of Congress? Do you want Congress delegating its power to declare war over to the United Nations? Do you want the United Nations and the Security Council imposing its will on the United States of America? As I'm recording this show, our public servants are unlawfully delegating the sovereignty of the United States of America and the American people over to the United Nations and its charter, and they are doing it without any opposition from we the people. What's that all about? This is exactly what the King of England was doing to the colonists prior to the American Revolution. This fact is contained in the Declaration of Independence. Quote, he is combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. That's taken right directly from the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted in Congress July 4, 1776. That's what the 4th of July is all about, celebrating our Declaration of Independence from England. It's not Firecracker Day or whatever people call it today. It actually had a meaning in history. The United Nations Charter is a jurisdiction that is foreign to our Constitution, and our public servants have unlawfully given their assent to the United Nations Act or acts of pretended legislation. Now think about that for a moment. How long are you going to let this situation continue to exist? How long before it's too late? All of our public servants, state and federal. This includes members of Congress, and the President have sworn enough to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. Why then are we allowing our public servants to violate their oath of office? Why are we allowing them to do that? There is nothing in our constitution, state and federal is what I'm trying to say, that allows any public servant to take an oath to uphold and defend the United Nations Charter. Now, is there? Our elected representatives become domestic enemies. A domestic enemy is a citizen that has betrayed his country and the law of the land. Treason, a betraying, treachery, or breach of allegiance by not meeting the mandates of their oaths of office. They are in violation of their allegiance to this nation and its Constitution and must be held accountable for their actions. When a United States citizen acknowledges the United Nations Charter as the supreme law of the world, that citizen is a traitor to this nation and has, in effect, denounced his or her citizenship. As the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Reed versus Culvert, the one we cited just before, quote, the prohibitions of the Constitution were designed to apply to all branches of national government, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. There's nothing in House Joint Resolution 77 that indicates that Congress was authorizing war pursuant to the Constitution of the United States. There is nothing in the resolution that indicates that the United States was under attack or in danger of being attacked. Congress had no constitutional authority to commit our troops to war pursuant to the mandates of the United Nations Security Council. If the United States were going to go to war, if the United States were going to go to war with Iraq, then a declaration of war must be issued by Congress under the authority of the United States Constitution. And that's end of story. You can't do it any other way. And they do it outside of the Constitution over and over and over again. The United States must declare war in the name of the United States, independent of the United Nations Charter. If it were otherwise, it would invite Congress to adopt future resolutions that could further undermine our nation's sovereignty. Congress could, theoretically, delegate its war-making authority over to any foreign body politic it so desired. Perhaps in the near future, Congress will allow the president to use United States Armed Forces pursuant to the laws of China or Canada or some other foreign nation. Even the highly controversial Tonkin Gulf resolutions, 1964, the start of the Vietnam thing, House Joint Resolution 1145 that committed the United States Armed Forces to fight the United Nations war in Vietnam, police action they called it, it vaguely met the constitutional requirements under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Section 2 said, consonant with the Constitution of the United States and the Charter of the United Nations, and in accordance with its obligations under the Southeast Asian Collective Defense Treaty, Tonkin Gulf Resolution, August 10th, 1964. But even though they mentioned the Constitution, there still was no declaration of war. It was clearly in violation of the Constitution, but at least they went as far as to mention the Constitution. So the Vietnam War was unconstitutional. So Korea was unconstitutional, and every other war that we've seen since then. They're all unconstitutional. They're all illegal. Nobody in this country is bound to serve in the military in any of these wars. That's not what they signed up for. In fact, it makes everybody that's fighting these wars, as it did me when I was in Vietnam, it makes us war criminals because everything we're doing is unlawful. It's illegal. Now, in order for House Joint Resolution 77 to be constitutionally valid, it must authorize the president to use the United States Armed Forces pursuant to and consistent with the United States Constitution. There must be a declaration of war by an act of Congress. A brief review of the congressional record, January 12, 1991, clearly reveals that Congress was aware that President Bush was about to commit treason. It also shows that the only reason Congress passed House Joint Resolution 77 was to protect President Bush from efforts of impeachment. Mr. Fassel, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, stated this, quote, "Of course, theoretically, the president could, even if this resolution is not adopted, order the use of force. But we all know that this would create a constitutional crisis with efforts of impeachment." And that's right from the congressional record, January 12, 1991. So they knew that what he was doing was illegal. So they were going to do something just as illegal to make it appear that Bush was doing something legal. Efforts of impeachment. That's what the man said. Congress, instead of holding President Bush accountable for what he was doing, joined him in his unlawful endeavor and committed treason against the United States right alongside of him. Here's what President Bush said to the American people on January 16, 1991 at 9:01 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just after he acted pursuant to House Joint Resolution 77 and the resolutions mandated by the United Nations Security Council against Iraq. His statement is conclusive that his allegiance was to the United Nations and its founders only. Quote, "We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for the future generations a new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promises and visions of the UN's founders." George Bush statement by the president January 16, 1991. He didn't mention anything about the founders of the United States of America and their visions. He could care less about the Constitution of the United States and whether or not he has the power to declare war. What happened in his statement? What happened to the promises and visions of the founders of the United States? It is apparent that the United States Constitution had little or no meaning to President George Bush. Further review of the congressional record reveals that the Bush administration deliberately provoked Saddam Hussein into an armed confrontation. It was a giant bait-and-switch game, as it were. This was addressed by Senator Kennedy on January 12, 1991. He said, quote, "As late as 1 week before the invasion of Kuwait, the Bush administration was actively resisting efforts in Congress to impose sanctions against Saddam. On the eve of the invasion, our diplomats were telling Saddam that the United States had no interest in Iraq's boundary dispute with Kuwait. Okay, that's a congressional record, January 12, 1991. Senator Kennedy went on to say, quote, in one of the worst miscalculations in the history of modern American foreign policy, the Bush administration told Saddam Hussein that we told him point blank, face to face, that the United States had no opinion about Iraq's border dispute with Kuwait. That miscalculation gave Saddam Hussein all the green light he needed to invade his rich but helpless neighbor, unquote. Congressional record, January 12, 1991. Now, you're starting to get the picture here? As soon as Saddam Hussein moved his troops into Kuwait, President Bush started to, unconstitutionally, against the law, committing an act of treason, started to move some 200,000 American troops into Saudi Arabia, pursuing to the mandates of the United Nations only. Between August 2nd and November 28th of 1990, the United Nations passed 11 resolutions pertaining to the so-called crisis in the Gulf. The crisis that was created by the United Nations and their number one man, President George Bush. On November 29th, the United Nations Security Council made an extremely bold move. It passed Resolution 678, authorizing its member states to use all means necessary by January 15, 1991, unless Iraq fully complied with its previous resolutions. Where did the United Nations get this kind of unbridled power? Did they get it from you? Did they get it from me? Did they get it from the Constitution of the United States? From that point on, President Bush completely ignored his oath of office to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. He was obsessed with carrying out the will of the United Nations Security Council and ordered even more troops into Saudi Arabia until the number approached 500,000. Now, when public concerns about what President Bush was doing became apparent, Congress stepped in and the debate started. Who was authorized to declare war? Congress or the president? The crux of the congressional debates revolved around President Bush's open contempt, his open contempt for Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the United States Constitution. Instead of doing what was right, i.e., charging President Bush with treason. I mean, this is an act of treason. Congress instead went to his rescue and passed House Joint Resolution 77. Congress didn't even try to cover up what the president was doing. Instead, they joined him. Now, in a letter written to me by Congressman Gonzalez, he addressed his concern about this problem. He said, and I quote, "The president never took his case to Congress where there could be a full and open debate on the question of war. Instead, the president waited until 500,000 troops, lives were on the line, and the majority of Congress believed that they had no choice but to support the president, particularly since he stated he would go to war even if Congress prohibited it." That was Henry B. Gonzalez, member of Congress, and he introduced House Resolution 34, a resolution of impeachment of President Bush. That was taken from a letter that was actually written to me. That was January 29th, 1991. Well, the rest of the story is now history. The United Nations Security Council's deadline, January 15th, 1991, came, and President Bush started bombing Iraq. From the beginning of the purported Gulf Crisis, President Bush demonstrated his contempt for the people of this nation and his contempt for the Constitution of the United States. like the 250 congressmen that passed House Joint Resolution 77, President Bush's allegiance was solely to the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. The president, Congress, and the blind public were so dedicated to the United Nations and the establishment of its new world order that they were willing to violate the United States Constitution and sacrifice American blood in order to establish it. For President Bush, the desire to carry out the will of the United Nations became an obsession for dictatorial power. George Bush wanted to be King George Bush. In fact, when Congress challenged his action, he became extremely belligerent. He stated publicly that he disagreed with the United States Constitution as it pertains to the war-making authority. He took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, and he's saying, I disagree with it. I think that the president should have the authority to declare war. President Bush contended that the president should have the sole authority to declare war. Our founding fathers were concerned about this type of totalitarian thinking. Having fought a long and difficult war for their independence, they carefully debated the issue of who would have the power to declare war. With the threat of tyranny still fresh in their minds, our founding fathers specified that no single person would have the power to commit our nation's blood or its treasure to war. No single person. Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers that the American president's power would amount to, quote, nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces. Didn't have the Air Force back then. He said that the president's authority would be much inferior to that of the British king, because the king declared war and raised and regulated the army and navy, quote, all of which, by the Constitution under consideration, would pertain to the legislator. And may I add, the legislator only. When Pierce Butler of South Carolina proposed that the war-making power be vested solely in the president, saying, quote, that the president would never go to war unless the nation was behind him, no one at the Constitutional Convention supported Butler. Not one person. As a result of their debates, Article 1 of the United States Constitution was ratified, authorizing Congress the power. Congress, and only Congress, the power to declare war. And that's never changed. Not the law. Only those people who circumvent it and act like they can go ahead and do whatever they want. And that includes the president we have today. President Bush made himself clear. He was going to go to war. Not under the authority of the United States, by a lawful act of Congress, but under the pretended authority of the United Nations. Treason. This is treason. And he was going, and I quote, he was going to do so with or without the consent of Congress. Clearly an act of treason. Who in the hell does he think he is that he doesn't have to obey the very document that he took an oath to uphold and defend? And this goes for everybody. I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. This, in my lifetime, this particular instance is so-called Gulf Crisis. I call it desert dust. All the elements of treason were there all the time. Very easy for me to go through and show you. And that's not that long ago, 26 years ago. And today they just do. They don't even talk Congress. They don't even talk Congress at all. They just do it. They think, well, I wonder if the president is actually going to go to war. Congress says, I wonder what he's going to do. It's like, hey guys, he can't do anything unless you Give them the authorization. Today, treason in America, it's an everyday practice. It's now politically correct to undermine the United States Constitution. It seems to me that the more openly corrupt the candidate is, the better chance of his winning an election to office. Now, I'm going back a bit here, but this is a really good example of this. I mean, one that we can all remember because it was in the public eye for quite a while. An example of this was the nomination of Oliver North as a Republican candidate for the Senate in Virginia. If you remember, Oliver North was caught lying to Congress. I mean, outright lying to Congress. There's no question. He was also caught selling illegal arms to a foreign nation. Okay, now everybody knew that. So with this knowledge, what did the people of Virginia do? They nominated him as a Republican candidate for the senator of their state. Oliver North, a known traitor and liar, for Senate. Why not? Prescott Bush, who financed Hitler, was also brought into the Senate. Wrong becomes right, and right becomes wrong. I think it probably would have most assuredly destroyed his political career if somebody were to expose him, or would have exposed him of any righteousness from his past. He never would have made it into office. Okay, well, where do we go from here? Now, it's always been my goal to expose as much educational material as I possibly can to the American public. We are not going to get that from the lamestream media and its prostitutes, and you're surely not going to get it from the government full system. We've been practicing the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto, free education in public schools, since 1954, and I'm telling you, the curriculum in the schools is so anti-American that I wouldn't even know where to start. So what I try to do is I try to do it from a private level to put out information that each of us can use, and valid information so we can understand. And we have to understand this from the layman's level. You know, we're not lawyers that can go up here and manipulate the law and lie, and most of us sit back because we don't know what's going on. We're just sitting there while these people take us for a ride. I think that this is the only way that we're going to be able to do this, is educating ourselves in this manner. Everything I say is well documented, and you can check it out for yourself, but you cannot make a difference if you don't know how it works. This is why I always include citations in my commentaries. I encourage my listeners to do their own research on the information that is provided in these shows. The only way that we, the people, as a collective, what little collective you have in a free society, because everybody wants to be their own individual, which is great, but we have to understand and protect the document that allows us to be able to move free, or it used to allow us, because it doesn't anymore, because nobody obeys in any branch of government anymore. So the only way that we, the people, can turn this nation around is by educating ourselves, doing ourselves. And then we have to educate our neighbors and our children. I know it's difficult because the brainwashing is really complete. We're having to bring people who are so brainwashed back to reality that I don't know whether or not it can be accomplished or not. We'll see. Unfortunately, our government, the public fool system, as I call it, and the news media have failed us completely in this area. It's totally run by those who are in charge. Because of this, the process of re-educating our nation has to be carried out through a grassroots movement of individuals like myself and like yourself, because if you're listening, then you're involved in this. And if you've learned something, I know you're going to share it. And once I'm telling you, it says that it's, the truth shall make you free. People say the truth shall set you free, but it actually, the scripture said the truth will make you free. And the freedom it makes you is when you have the knowledge and you understand what's really going on, you are free. Because when somebody does something that is illegal, one of your servants violates your rights, and you know what those rights are, there is something that you can do about it. And if everybody knows what their rights are, those are the people who are going to be sitting on your juries. And they understand the law. They'll know what a bad, unconstitutional law is, and they will acquit. Even if somebody violated the unconstitutional law, they will acquit them. They will make sure that that unconstitutional law is no longer used, at least in their community, against any one of their fellow citizens. And at the grand jury level, you won't indict on these stupid unconstitutional laws. But if you don't know they're unconstitutional, there isn't anything that you're going to be able to do. You're a victim. Ignorance makes you a victim. Come out of your ignorance. Because sooner or later you're going to have to do something. Because it's getting so bad that eventually you're going to have to do something. And wouldn't it be easier to educate yourself now and do something now so that you can thwart off this and it could be a military coup d'etat. Right now it's a political coup d'etat, but it's still a coup d'etat. They're overthrowing the United States as I speak. Sometimes I feel like this is too late for me to get this information out, but I feel compelled that I have to do it, so I do it. And I do it for free because there should never be anything attached to this. It is time for those of us who are right to challenge those who are wrong. There is no left or right here. There's only right and wrong. Which side of the line are you standing on? If you're not part of the solution, then you are the problem. If you're politically correct, then you're legally wrong. I am the Ghetto Man. Thank you for watching.
You may think you hold all the aces,